Have you ever wondered how this KGB thug from St. Petersburg ended up becoming the most feared dictator in the world? How did one man build this regime that's built on assassinations, lies, and terror? Well, today we'll look into that, but I'll give you already a hint. The key to understanding the Putin regime is to understand that Vladimir Putin does not run a government. Vladimir Putin commands a mafia state with nuclear weapons. And in his eyes, loyalty is bought with blood, truth is an ultimate threat, and survival depends on silencing anybody who knows too much or who could expose him for who he is. Because ultimately, though, it is not just Putin. It's an entire system that has been built. And that system today is under tremendous weight. That system could very well collapse. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I've spent 2 decades looking into the Putin regime, which banned me from Russia back in 2010. Before we begin, I ask you to help me by please liking this video and also subscribing to this channel. It helps me get the truth about the Putin regime to more people and to expose it for what it really is. Every click really does help. Thank you. So fundamentally, let's understand that Putin did not rise to power through a great political campaign or elections or some sort of ideas that inspired people. He rose through terror. And to understand where that terror starts, the genesis of this, we have to go back to September 1999, when there was a wave of deadly bombings that hit Moscow and 2 other cities in Russia. More than 300 civilians died. Most of them were asleep when it occurred. Now, the Kremlin immediately came out and said that this was done by Chechen terrorists. The Chechens were seeking to free themselves from Russia's yoke, and they wanted independence, and so were engaged now in terrorism. That was the narrative that the Kremlin sold the public. But there was a growing list of voices who immediately contradicted that. And increasingly more information trickled out, that seemed to show that it was very improbable that Chechens were behind this. Amongst those voices were people like David Satter, the Financial Times bureau chief, one of the foremost experts in the world on Putin's Russia. There was people like FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko. And there's even members of the Russian parliament who all came out and said, there's something strange here. It looks like the FSB orchestrated these attacks. Now, some of the evidence behind that, should you be curious, is that one, the Chechens have always said they had nothing to do with this, and usually they take credit for terrorist acts when they commit them. But secondly, was a group of men were found to be bringing live explosives into the basement of an apartment building late one night. When the local cops showed up, they were able to identify the men as being FSB officers. Well, what makes that interesting is that the FSB at first, of course, denied it, and later said this was a training exercise. Now, it would seem very improbable that you are doing a training exercise in a random apartment building well past midnight while everybody's asleep using live explosives. It would seem more probable that the FSB was intending to blow up this building. But neither here nor there, that's the background to why a lot of people believe the FSB probably orchestrated these attacks. Now, you might ask, who would do that though? Who was the guy behind that? Well, sure enough, back in 1999, there's an obscure figure named Vladimir Putin who is heading the FSB. Now, he came out very strongly and said they were going to investigate and go after the Chechens. And this strong public interest led to him having greater notoriety. And within a few days of the bombings, sure enough, Putin became the prime minister under Boris Yeltsin. By December of that year, he had already launched the Second Chechen War, which is widely popular. Now, keep in mind, rally around the flag effect. When you start wars and people really do believe that you're protecting them, of course, your popularity shoots up. And by early 2000, guess what? He was already the acting president of Russia. In fact, on December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin said he'd be giving over the keys to Russia to Putin. David Satter has called this the crime that ushered in Putin to power. And you might ask, why was it that Yeltsin did this? Why would Yeltsin agree to bring in this guy who's blowing up apartment buildings to boost his popularity? Very simply, Yeltsin was never the Democrat that many people hoped that he was. Yeltsin was most interested in covering up the corruption, his own and of his family, namely of his daughter and son-in-law, who were engaged in mass corruption throughout the 90s and were robbing Russia. And to make sure that nothing would ever come of that would always be covered up, he needed somebody who would do it. And somebody who's willing to kill women and children to help boost his popularity, innocent people, just because. It's not even a war. That's the sort of person that you could probably count on to successfully cover up your corruption and never think twice about it. But Vladimir Putin has proven himself to be somebody with no moral qualms about much of anything. And ultimately, you might ask, so what sort of person is Vladimir Putin? We should ask that. What sort of person would order the murder of his own civilians, of his own citizens? It's because you have to understand that in the eyes of Vladimir Putin and his worldview as a whole, fear is not a failure of leadership. Rather, it's a tool for control. And this is something that comes with Putin being a product of years of Soviet ideology, training in East Germany, being a KGB officer, knowing Marxist, Leninist doctrine up and down, being totally fluent in the logic of dialectical materialism, which is the Hegelian idea that the Soviets were very fond of, and they adapted. And ultimately, that idea boils down to conflict creates control. So for those of you who might be a little bit rusty on Hegel or Hegelian dialectics, it's a way of thinking about progress that happens only through a clash. That is, first there's an idea, which they call the thesis. Then it's challenged by the opposite, called the antithesis. And out of this conflict between the thesis and antithesis, it produces a new result. And this new result is called the synthesis. So an example would be a government creates fear. There's a terrorist attack, and the Chechens are accused of trying to blow up apartment buildings. The public demands safety, which is the antithesis. And then guess what? The synthesis, the new result. The government is able to gain more power by offering security because there was a terrorist attack, there was a public outcry. The reaction, the new result, is that the government provides security, which is what the people have demanded. This is exactly, quite literally, Hegelian dialectics, what the Soviet Union was built on. This is what Putin has learned his whole life, and this is how Putin came to power. So, in the case of Putin, we see this throughout his life. And in this case, obviously, you see it clearly where he creates a crisis, provoked a reaction, and he offered himself as the solution, the savior. And so, more fundamentally, if we want to understand Putin's worldview, there's a dark philosophy that is fused with this. And it's a very Soviet atheistic view of humanity. There's something else that David Satter has written quite a bit about, which that Putin sees people as having no intrinsic value. They're tools meant to be used and then discarded. So if their death serves the purposes of the state, or more precisely, they help with Putin's personal grip on power, then so be it. So to Vladimir Putin, human beings are like disposable cups. You use it once and you throw it away. If you never use it, it can still be thrown away because it's simply unnecessary, inconvenient, superfluous. So if sacrificing lives helps fulfill the immediate needs of the Russian state, and Putin views himself as being the Russian state, the center of it, then those lives are expendable. So from the eyes of Vladimir Putin, blowing up those apartment buildings, and it's not a tragedy. That was a tactic, very easily justifiable, and it achieved its objectives. It worked. In August 1999, Putin's approval rating was less than 2%. Nobody knew who he was. By early October, it was more than 50%, according to Russia's Levada Center. How is it that a faceless bureaucrat became a wartime leader almost overnight? Well, this is not just simply about the beginning of his reign. It's a blueprint. Because for any person because if human life has no inherent value, then every atrocity becomes justifiable, so long as it serves the purpose. And that's why in Ukraine, where we see that Putin routinely bombs things like children's hospitals, for him it's not murder, it's strategy. He believes that by inflicting maximum suffering, he can morally exhaust Ukraine. And that after enough dead children, shattered homes, and dark nights without power, Ukrainians will surrender. And then he will offer them peace. Once again, synthesis. Peace. The dialectic again. Impose terror, break the will, offer a false solution. Now, in the case of Ukraine, it's turned out a little bit differently. The Ukrainians haven't broken. And I think ultimately for Vladimir Putin, that terrifies him. Because in the mind of somebody who sees humans as being purely disposable, moral resistance is something that he cannot understand, nor is it something that he can defeat. So today, after more than 25 years, what began as a series of bombings did not end there. It is not just a series of bombings or a singular act of bloodshed. It's evolved into a system, an entire machine of theft and violence that's run by the very same men today in Moscow. And this Kremlin mafia is currently operating not just within Russia and not only invading Ukraine, it's operating globally. And let's take a look at who some of those leaders are. Who are the inner leadership of the Kremlin? So very important, Nikolai Patrushev, close friend of Putin's, going back decades. He was formerly the FSB director between 1999 and 2008. Convenient period of time. That's when the Chechen War was going on. So you can be sure that he was working with Putin during that period of time. And he would have been on the ins, he would have known about the apartment bombings back in 1999. He himself, of course, played a central role in the Chechen War and in all the surveillance laws that they introduced post-1999. One other thing that makes him very important and why he's considered to be of the highest trust of Putin is not just because obviously he does promote things such as the color revolution hysteria, the fear of biolabs. I think that's very secondary, though a lot of people do talk about that. Much more important is that he plays a critical role in the purges. That is, he personally works on things like the poisoning of people who know too much. He helps with counterintelligence to find who's not loyal. This is somebody who is of supreme loyalty to Putin. They're extremely close. Putin trusts him with things that nobody can ever know about. And we see that Putin truly does trust him. And we see the result, the most obvious example of that is that his son, Dmitry, was formerly the Minister of Agriculture of Russia for years and years and years. And at this point, he's the Deputy Prime Minister for Agro-Industrial Complexes. He deals with natural resources and environmental policies. And a lot of people, myself included, believe that he is the most likely successor to Vladimir Putin. So something interesting about this gentleman is that he's also famous for another reason that you've probably read his name before, which is that British intelligence concluded that in 2006, when Alexander Litvinenko, remember, he's the KGB officer who I mentioned earlier, when he was killed in London, when his tea was poisoned by polonium-210, a lot of people say that it's likely that Patrushev personally ordered that hit. Now, a trivia question. Why is it that he would order the hit right now? Well, aside from making public a lot of things that Putin didn't really like, including the apartment bombings, there's something very specific that Litvinenko said immediately before being killed. He accused Putin of maintaining a very, let's call it, unhealthy interest in little children. So this sort of chilling allegation added a disturbing personal dimension as to who is Vladimir Putin. And undoubtedly, that played a role in moving up the prioritization that Litvinenko got killed in the near term. Now, Patrushev himself has been tied to corruption scandals, probably not surprisingly, namely the large-scale smuggling and money laundering done by senior FSB officers called the Three Whales investigation. And it was blocked and slowed down by prosecutors. Now, that's probably not surprising because we're dealing with Russia, but the money laundering was massive. It wasn't small. It included Russia, China, United States, And U.S. intelligence actually did try to help the Russians investigate that before it became clear that the Russians were not interested in pursuing this. So another big name is Sergei Shoigu. He's a minister of emergency situations between 1991 and 2012. Then he's a minister of defense from 2012 to 2024. What happened in that period of time? Well, he was there and he oversaw the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. But eventually, last year, in a very exciting moment for Kremlinologists, he was removed. Why was he removed? Major battle losses. The Russians had lost over 600,000 casualties in Ukraine. They lost over 3,600 tanks, which is more than the number of all the European NATO tanks combined. Shoigu just simply wasn't cutting it. So Putin had to shift things up. Now, who else is a big name? Yuri Kovalchuk, who's the chairman of Rossiya Bank. He's often called Putin's personal banker, to give you perspective of why he's important. Now, he controls a lot of media and finances that are offshore, not just for Putin, but also for a lot of elites. And we've seen that proven in things like the Panama Papers. More than that, another thing is his name is on the documents for the $1.35 billion Black Sea mansion that is, according to Alexei Navalny, owned by Vladimir Putin. And it probably is owned by Vladimir Putin. So he is the personal cutout for Vladimir Putin. He personally handles the world's richest man's finances. Obviously, that makes him a person of high personal trust. Now, another person of high personal trust is Arkady Rotenberg. He's also a childhood judo partner of Putin. And today, he's a multi-billionaire. He built the Sochi Olympics back in 2012. He built the Crimean Bridge. He owns a huge part of military logistics. He's gotten over $7 to $8 billion in state contracts. And he's known to have a ton of front companies that he uses across the world, including Europe and the Middle East. But when you look at how this all fits together, to understand how these men keep power, let's look at the machine that they built. What is fundamentally underneath this? So, in 2024, the military budget hit 7.1% of GDP. And of course, it's a lot of spending, and it's unsustainable for the Russian state. But we can ask, so there's no longer money for the hospitals or the schools or the roads, but there's plenty of money now going to Rotenberg, Kovalchuk, Shoigu, and through all these dozens of fake companies that they own, where they're regularly invoicing the state for incredibly high inflated prices. And we know how corrupt this regime really is because a lot of it's already been exposed. It's not news. Now, Alexei Navalny, who I know there's very mixed opinions about the man, but he did expose some of the corruption associated with Putin, for which he was poisoned in 2020. He was in prison in 2021, and he was killed in prison in 2024. But before getting killed, he was involved with a lot of investigations that did pretty well, pretty clearly show, using leaked bank documents, insider testimony, other things, that Putin's inner circle was undoubtedly stealing billions of dollars of states' assets. And one of the most explosive things, as I mentioned, is the $1.3 billion palace on the Black Sea, which was all paid for through a network of corrupt state contracts and kickbacks. That video got over 100 million views, and it became sort of a symbol of the regime's greed and total impunity. This theft that occurs in Russia is not just one person. It's a coordinated system across the entire country. So today, while tens of thousands of Russian soldiers are dying in Ukraine, a small group of insiders are becoming obscenely rich, all from inflated military contracts and war profiteering. So who wants the war to end? Who would gain from that? Certainly not the people close to Vladimir Putin. They certainly do not want to see this war end. And to understand why, just look at how Putin operates. We know that Putin is extremely secretive about his health, about his location. It's widely believed, and I strongly believe, that he uses body doubles. And that's something that we can see either through the physical discrepancies of these doubles, such as the mismatched ears or their height, but also because Putin does a few things that you can always pick out. One is that he always travels with some specific bodyguards. He always travels with specific doctors. And when you don't see them in the photos, probably a good sign that it's not Putin. But anyways, these substitutions are used just as a means to, once again, show how much he doesn't want to be exposed to the public, how secretive he is. And that's why should you be surprised that he would order the murder of somebody who exposes his darkest secrets? And keep in mind, Vladimir Putin doesn't receive a lot of information either. He doesn't understand, I think, how the war is going in Ukraine. I fundamentally do not believe he understands how bad the situation is in Russia. And that's because on most days, according to the records that we have, Putin likely only speaks to perhaps 2 to 4, maybe 5 individuals. And the vast majority of those people are going to be people from his inside circle. Nikolai Patrushev, remember the presidential aide whose son may succeed Putin. There's Shoigu, who was the Minister of Defense, now he's the Secretary of the Security Council. Kovalchuk, who is his closest oligarch ally and the head of the bank. We got Sergei Nareshkin, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, and Anton Vaino, who's his chief of staff. And they call this little group the Politburo 2.0. And what it really does is it shields Putin from outside information and only further reinforces his worldview. So undoubtedly they're feeding him exaggerated reports of battlefield successes, insisting that Russia is making some historic gains, they're fighting off NATO and winning. And though there's huge casualties mounting, Russia will prevail. But why do they lie? Because they're getting rich. These men are earning hundreds of thousands of dollars each day from their inflated military contracts, from their war profiteering. And the longer that this war continues, the more that they benefit. It's amazing, isn't it? So it's not about geopolitics or national pride or ideology. It's about money and control for a small group of men. They are willing to destroy their own countrymen, to protect their power. Now, makes sense though. As the Soviets said, people have no inherent value. If you are the state, people, goods, mutually interchangeable. So a couple 100,000 people die, but the state benefits, and you are the state. You represent the state. And then it was in the interest of the state that you've become wealthier and those people died. So these oligarch firms, we know that they own a lot of things and they get state contracts. So as 1,500 Russian soldiers a day are being casualties, as Russia's economy is being totally raked over the coals, they're getting the contracts for building parts of the drones, for missiles, radios, boots. They're all controlled by Putin's allies. And what they would never want to have is an audit. An audit would be very bad. But peace can bring audits. A change of government can bring audits. Being exposed would be the worst thing that could happen to them. So why would they want peace? It increases their risk factor. But let's look globally. How does the Mafia operate abroad? So the Putin syndicate operates abroad with partners. There's 2 types of partners. There's state actors and non-state actors. The state actors are countries that we know about, such as North Korea, such as Iran. There's non-state actors, which are terrorist organizations that are sanctioned, so they can have a few other options with whom they can do business. And there's other illegal organizations. Mafias, for instance. The Russian mafia, for instance. Drug traffickers, for instance. People involved in illegal immigration. People are involved in the trafficking of weapons. The Russian state works with people like them. And what's interesting is that the Russian state does not always directly play a role, but it uses indirect actors. That is, it might task different oligarchs to get involved in something that would benefit the state. For instance, running troll factories. That's something that the government might not pay for directly, but rather it uses oligarchs, uses their money, sort of coerces or encourages them strongly to go pursue something. And those oligarchs can spend their money to do things like propaganda. So let's look at different organizations that Russia works with. And I think one of the most interesting examples, one of the most illustrative examples, is probably Hezbollah and Hamas, close allies of Russia. So in 2015, Russian advisors operate alongside Hezbollah inside of Syria. We know that. It's very public. And within a week of the October 7th attacks in Israel, just last year, a couple years ago, the Kremlin invited Hamas to Moscow. Now, in return, what happens? Hamas and Hezbollah receive weapons, they receive cyber support, they receive political cover. And what does Russia get? Russia gets some leverage, a proxy, which it can use against Israel, NATO, the United States, etc. Interesting. How about Latin America? Venezuela, of course. Russia props up Nicolas Maduro with the loans, with the military cooperation, and in exchange, Venezuela banks are used to launder the money for Hezbollah. More than $300 million a year in the narcotics trade. And in the tri-border area, which is Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, one of the top places for Hezbollah in the world, it's used for smuggling arms as well as with drugs. Hezbollah logistics which of course are backed by the Iranian state, specifically the Iranian Quds forces, they work with Russia directly as well. All these things are tied together. Iran, Venezuela, Hezbollah, the narcos, they all tie together. It's a coordinated system, and Russia is the kingpin of it. So if you want to look back at a different side, it's probably not surprising when you look at Europe the last couple of decades, look at the United States. Right before elections, there's a surge of illegal immigration. Guess where there's a surge from, specifically in the case of the United States? There's a surge from Venezuela and Nicaragua, two countries that have tight relations with Russia. Look up the data right before the presidential elections and look 2 years before. Look at the number of people caught in the border from those two countries and look at the surge. Not by coincidence. Syria, obviously the Russians were backing the Assad regime for years, destroying the country of Syria, creating a migration crisis. Those migrants ended up in different countries in Europe, namely in Germany and France, Belgium, others. And what's the result? Far-right parties do well. You remember right before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, back in 2022, the crisis of immigration orchestrated on the borders, specifically in Belarus, with Lithuania, with Poland. What was going on there? Well, sure enough, tons of people were being imported from Africa, from the Middle East, and that was by Russia to create immigration crisis. Because they know that using immigration crises and using human traffickers is a means that they can try to affect domestic politics in other countries. Does it surprise you that they also work with terrorist organizations like Hezbollah or with drug traffickers? Or in Latin America, the fact is, increasing the weapons that are being used by the drug traffickers come from the Middle East. And you look at someone like Victor Bout, who was pardoned, unfortunately, by Biden, but this man who is trafficking in weapons around the world, the Lord of War, as the movie with Nicolas Cage is about him, this man is obviously operating on behalf of the Russian state. Once again, he might not be officially working for the Russian state today, but it's very clear whose interest he's serving by trafficking weapons to these cartels or to these dictatorships or to these other exploitive groups or mafias around the world. This is all part of Russia's global mafia. So ultimately, what do we see here? Ultimately, everything that we see, whether it's 1999, where Putin is blowing up some apartment buildings, or if it's 2025, where Putin is blowing up apartment buildings now in Ukraine, this is part of a system. This is not a one-off. And that's why it's actually quite predictable what Putin will or will not do. Because ultimately, this is not just authoritarianism. This is racketeering. It's an organized crime with embassies. This is a global mafia that uses the trappings of being a normal country, which it relishes in. It loves that. It loves the fact that it is treated as if it is a normal country, when in fact, it is a global mafia. So now that I hope that you understand this, what do we do? What do we do about a global mafia that operates this way? Unfortunately, though much of what we've discussed today is something that is public, the governments know about this, it's not a secret, very few governments are willing to approach this. Very few are willing to accept the fact that we are trying to have diplomacy with somebody who has no economic gain from diplomacy, who in fact has a global empire to maintain. And by ending the war or lifting some sanctions, doesn't necessarily improve his personal situation. He's seeking, as is his entire clan, what is best for them, not necessarily best for the Russian state, which makes it very hard, I think, for some of our diplomats and leaders to understand why we're so totally different. He doesn't care what the result will be for Russia if he benefits from it. But the best thing that we can do right now, in the past 20 years of looking into this, I think the best thing that we can do is that we should expose the regime fully. The more that we expose this, the more that this is made public, the more that journalists write about this, the worse it makes it for Putin and his gang. Because ultimately, as I said, what they fear the most is being exposed. So going ahead, whatever we can do to shine light on this so others know about it, so that Putin's own population knows about this, the better. And we've just begun touching on this theme. This goes obviously much, much deeper than what we were able to discuss today. And undoubtedly, I'll make more videos about this if you think it's interesting. If you think it's interesting, please note so below in the comments and give a like. And please subscribe to this channel so I can spread this to more people. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin does not fear NATO. He only fears being exposed. And he knows very well that if Russians learn the truth, he will be doomed. It will be the end of the Putin regime. Thank you for watching. And thank you, as always, for supporting Ukraine.